Hello fear seekers, and welcome back to the channel. Today, we're going to be diving into some disturbing, true Cryptid Encounter horror stories. Now, it is a dream of mine to be able to read subscriber horror stories someday. With that in mind, I'd ask that you subscribe to the channel and like the video so we can make that happen together. If you have any stories you are willing to share, please send them to the email in the description. I would be honored to read them. Now without further ado, sit back, put any idea of sleep away, and get ready to ferment your fears. I saw a humanoid, something in the woods outside my childhood home. This was rural northern Wisconsin, and I was 14. Up until that day, I had zero fear of the woods. I spent most of my time out there exploring, and feared nothing. My parents had a lousy marriage and fought a lot, and I felt more at home outside than in the house. On hot nights, I'd take a sleeping bag and sleep on the roof of an old shack on our property. I saw bears and wolves out there frequently. They were always more afraid of me than I was of them, though. I didn't believe in ghosts, Bigfoot, demons, or even God. I only got lost out there once when dark fell sooner than I had expected. I stayed calm, found the North Star, and knew that if I continued south, I'd eventually come across the old railroad tracks near my house. Even the thought of spending the night out there didn't bother me. The thought of my mom's rage when I didn't come home did, though. So, it was summer. I had just turned 14, and my mother had left my father. He worked all the time, and my sister was living on her own, so once school was out, it was just me and my cat. Keep in mind, this is before the internet or smartphones. We lived on a dead-end dirt road, and around noon, I took my usual stroll down the long driveway to check the mail. My cat followed me everywhere, and I actually kind of relied on him to give me a heads up if there was a bear or something close by. A bit of movement behind me as I stood at the mailbox made me aware there was something across the road in the trees, but there were pesky deer everywhere, so I didn't think too much of it. That is, until I heard a loud crash, like something very loudly making its way through the brush. It's like every classic horror story. My brain had no capability for the thought of anything paranormal or spooky. I simply tucked the mail under my arm and headed into the woods to investigate. My cat followed close behind. I got about 10 yards in when I noticed what I hadn't noticed before. There was no noise. Nothing. It was a beautiful June day, and there wasn't a single bird singing, no insects, no leaves rustling. It was absolutely silent. At the same time I registered the silence, I got that eerie feeling that something was watching me. I stopped immediately and started scanning the woods for deer. Hunters know what I'm talking about when I say you look for the shape of a deer instead of trying to pinpoint them by color. That's when I spotted it. 2 brown, furry legs, the top of it concealed by tree branches. I went to sigh with relief when my cat hissed. I looked down and he was completely poofed out with his back arched, looking at the same thing I was. I looked back up and the legs moved. Not like a deer. Like a human. Everything happened at once after that. I dropped the mail, picked up my cat by the scruff, and ran for it. Whatever was out there with me was running after me. I have never run so fast in my life. I tore up the driveway, into the house, locked the door, and grabbed the phone. I called my next door neighbor who was the ex-chief of police, and he came over immediately with his pistol. He checked out the spot I was in and found nothing. I was so hysterical I was in tears. He stayed with me until I was able to reach my mom and have her come get me. Of course, they thought I was completely delusional. I know exactly what I saw and felt though. It was broad daylight. I never felt safe in those woods again, and I have never slept outside ever since. I was hiking up in the Cascades in Oregon. I was in a more remote area of the range. On the 6th or 7th day on the trail, the hair on the back of my neck began standing up. I chalked it up to there being a mountain lion in the area. But the weird thing was, the uneasy feeling never left. That night is when I heard the howling for the first time. It wasn't wolves or bears or any other animal I had ever heard. The closest thing I could relate it to is the noises apes and monkeys make. This persisted for the next few nights. Eventually, things started rummaging through my campsite. Naturally, I assumed it to be a bear or raccoons. But then on the 11th day, I woke up and my food bag was removed from the tree. Something had cut the line right through. All my food was gone. I decided to keep pushing. I had 4 days left till the end of the trail. I'm familiar with what I can and can't eat in the area, and I could always fish for food. The same nightly activities occurred, and on the 13th night, something started throwing rocks at my tent. For some reason, I lost it. I screamed into the darkness for whatever it was to leave me alone, hoping it was just some person messing with me, and maybe they'd scream out, "Sorry, mate," or something. Instead, it grew quiet for the first time in nights. Nothing could be heard. Then, a scream louder and more vicious than any I had ever heard cut through the night. Then nothing. Complete and utter silence once again. Despite it being quiet, I wasn't able to sleep that night. I just waited, paralyzed with fear. The next day, I continued my hike, dead tired, just wanting to get out at this point. The hair on the back of my neck still standing, the forest still quiet. I felt like I was being hunted. Towards the end of the day, I had sat down to rest before pushing a few more miles when I saw it. Something tall and large, bigger than any animal or man I had ever seen, sliding through the forest not making a noise. I yelled at it, and it turned to look at me. I never got a good look at it through the trees and the brush, and it was dark, but I knew that whatever it was, it had been causing all of this. I threw a rock at it, and then pulled my knife. This thing just kept staring at me. I don't know what kicked in, but I no longer felt scared. I felt angry, and I ran at the thing. It ran from me, and I chased it further into the woods. It had long strides and easily outpaced me, but I continued the chase. After several minutes, I gave up and collapsed in exhaustion. I rested for a bit before backtracking my way back to my backpack and resting area. I was tired and made camp there. Another night of silence. When I woke up the next day, I had about 10 miles till I was out. Exhausted, hungry, and mentally drained, I finally made my way out. As I got closer and closer to the end of the trail, the typical forest noises returned. Birds singing, bugs chirping, mice scampering through the undergrowth. All these noises slowly returned. I no longer had that feeling of unease that had plagued me for days. I got to the trail's end, sat in my car, and cried. To this day, I still pass it off as someone just messing with me, but the way that thing moved in the forest, I just don't know. I told the park ranger about it, and he jokingly said they have a bunch of Bigfoot sightings in the area, but most likely it was just a local playing a trick on me, or my own imagination running wild. I do a lot of long hikes, but that 15 days was by far the worst. About a year ago, I was out back with my family. It was around 8 p.m. and the sun was setting. We lived in a farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The closest neighbor was miles away. Something down the field kept catching my eye, but I ignored it at first. My sister saw it too, and kept looking out towards the trees. She was getting freaked out by whatever it was. My mom said to go investigate, so me and my sister started to walk across the field towards the tree line. Big mistake. It's hard for me to describe what happened next. This was the most terrifying thing that has ever happened to me. I didn't see it at first, and I didn't understand why my sister was so scared, until we were about 100 yards away, when I saw this creature. Tall, probably 8 or 9 feet in height. It was white, humanoid, with an elongated head, and no face. It had long arms and peeked around the trees. We stopped in our tracks. We couldn't tell what it was. It took a few steps further out of the trees and swayed back and forth at me like a praying mantis. My sister and I ran screaming back to the house, where my mom stood, jaw dropped and mouth gaping. She had seen it too. I had never been so scared in my entire life. We grabbed the binoculars and watched this terrifying creature peek in and out of the tree line, spying on us. My grandma thought we all had a wild imagination. The sun was almost gone now, and it was getting really dark, and the darker it got, the more it moved, almost as if it was emboldened by the night, back and forth along the trees. It was terrifying, so we went in for the night and locked everything up tight. I couldn't sleep at all that night. I was hearing scratching on the roof, and at one point, a very loud bang and various noises coming from the barn. I was very afraid that I would wake up to my animals all gone, or worse. The next morning, my grandma asked if we heard the loud bang outside that night. She ended up taking my grandpa with her on her morning walk. I have no idea what it was, and it still haunts me to this day. My entire childhood, my father and I used to take late-night walks due to insomnia brought about by his shift work. Our neighborhood is considered very safe and ultimately was an urban neighborhood, besides one of the roads towards the back of the neighborhood being lined with thick forest for about a mile. It was about a quarter of a mile deep and made a circle back into itself. All of these walks are very dear memories of mine, except for one, and it ended up being the last late-night walk we ever went on. Along the road that had the tree line, there was a single street light to illuminate a small plot of land that someone owned, but it was very overgrown and ill-kept. It was very common for us to walk this road to enjoy the sounds of the forest, the lack of illumination, and the ease of circling back. One ordinary night, as we were walking and making conversation, my father abruptly stops, pulls me close, puts a hand over my mouth, crouches with me, and points towards the single illuminated plot roughly 100 yards away. At first I didn't see anything and thought he was pulling my leg, but just as I began to protest his grasp, I see a very small humanoid figure, roughly 3 feet in height, scrawny, with long limbs, materialize out of the plot's brush line and cautiously take in its surroundings before signaling towards the brush. After a few seconds, 2 other small humanoid figures materialize as well. After a brief moment of what looked to be a discussion, all 3 made a dash for the forest tree line. Once this happened, my father picked me up, threw me over his shoulder, and made a break for our home, which was roughly a half-mile back. Mind you, my father is 6'5", 220 pounds, and I was roughly 120 pounds at this time, and he never showed signs of slowing due to his fear and adrenaline. After this night, we never took late-night walks again. He installed 4 bright motion detection lights around our acre plot, and brought home a dog. The few times I've tried bringing it up, he doesn't want to discuss it and made it clear he never wanted to. Those figures still give me chills, and the image of the three huddled together is very vivid, even 15 years later. So, this happened to my son when he was 17 years old. We lived in New Mexico at the time. My son, Cody, was riding along with his friends, Drew and Alex. They were in Drew's truck, and Drew was driving. It was night, and they were heading to Drew's house. Drew lived out in the country, so the road they were on was isolated and surrounded by desert. In fact, that whole area is flat and mostly dirt. As they're driving along, they see a man standing in the middle of the road. Drew slows down, and they all expect the guy to move off to the side. The figure doesn't move. He just stands there. Drew slows to a stop. The guy is standing just outside the light from the headlights. He's wearing jeans and some sort of long-sleeve shirt. They couldn't make out the features of the guy's face, but they could tell he was facing them. Nobody moved for a few seconds. The kids started to talk about going around him, but aren't sure if they should pass by this guy or turn around and go another way. Suddenly, the guy drops to all fours and starts running towards the truck. All the kids start screaming. Drew slams the truck into reverse and floors it. Now, they're going backwards on this dark country road, and this guy is chasing them on all fours. And he's keeping up with the truck. Drew goes faster, and finally the guy drops out of sight. Drew turns the truck around, and they all came back to our house. I was in the living room when they came running in, slammed and locked the door, and went tearing up the stairs to Cody's room. I went up to see what was going on, and this is when they told me the story. I've never seen them so pale and frightened. They were completely freaked out. This happened on a Friday night around 8 p.m. These were kids that normally would rather be anywhere except home on a weekend. That weekend, they stayed at our place the whole time. They didn't go out at all, and then only left because they had school on Monday. It took a month before they wanted to go out again at night. They would go anywhere during the day, but at night, they usually gathered at our house. After a little research, they all agreed that it was a skinwalker. Even to this day, if I bring up that night, Cody and his friends will get really quiet and start looking scared. It took a long time for them to get past it, and they still think that talking about it will make whatever it was come back. I wasn't sure where else to post this story, so I figured I'd share it here. My friends often joke that my family has a curse on it, or that we're descended from witches. Whatever the case, we've seen some things that I think you guys will be interested in. Here's the first of them. My mom comes from a pretty big family. She's one of 5 kids, and she has something like 15 first cousins. Of these 15, 4 live in America. The one whose story I will relate is a cop in Florida. When I asked him about the details of the incident, telling him I was going to share it with other people, he agreed, under the provision that I not say where he works. This case is rather disturbing to him, and rather an embarrassment to his superiors, and he'd rather not be besieged by questions about it. Anyway, back on subject. He's a police officer in a pretty skeevy part of Florida, with a pretty high crime rate. However, before you get excited, most of the time, it's just low-level opportunists. Overweight losers who are making moonshine out of their garden shed. Pimply teenagers who think they're hardened criminals and low-level drug peddlers. However, One night, he was called out on a very strange case. Apparently, a couple of guys had been found dead in their home. They were housemates, and a neighbor had called the police. When they arrived at the scene, they noticed one weird detail. The door to the house had been knocked down from the inside. Then they saw the bodies of the occupants. One of them was dead in the kitchen. He'd been bludgeoned to death and was so badly mutilated he could only be identified from his dental records. When they found him, they had trouble telling whether the body was a man or a woman. A shotgun was found nearby. They thought he'd tried to use it against the person or animal that had ultimately killed him. Rather mysteriously, it was snapped nearly in two, as if someone had grabbed it with their bare hands and bent it. Now, they thought this was an open and shut case. They were keeping, it turned out, many exotic animals in the house, illegally. There were live animals and animal parts everywhere. Snake skins, sea turtle shells, tiger bones, and even a live ocelot. They were, quite clearly, illegally smuggling exotic animals and animal parts into the US, so they assumed that some animal, possibly a baboon or a chimpanzee, had gotten out, possibly due to their own incompetence, and killed them before escaping. Then they found the other guy's remains, which threw all their theories right out of the window. He was dead in the basement. He was found by a very large cage, his windpipe crushed and the cage door open. Aside from the crushed windpipe, there wasn't a scratch on his body. His experience was one of shock and horror. They came to the only possible conclusion. The creature in there had strangled him through the bars, gotten the keys, and used them to let itself out, before killing the other guy and escaping. This was no ordinary animal. This was something with tremendous strength, dexterity, and intelligence. They were disturbed by this. Not even a chimpanzee would have the intelligence to plan its escape in such an intricate way. He informed his superiors of this. I mean, if something like that was still at large, wouldn't you want people to know about it? Now, before you ask, men in black suits didn't turn up and rather politely request that he not continue investigating this. In fact, his superiors appeared to treat the whole thing as a joke. They recommended that no paperwork be filled out about the whole incident. He remembers being rather disturbed by this. This was an incredibly large, strong, and intelligent wild animal that had savagely killed 2 people and which was now still at large, and they were treating it like it was a joke. He even said, "You'd think they'd be searching the woods for it." What disturbed him the most was how the creature had planned its own escape right down to the last detail. That took human-level intelligence. He even stated, when telling me about it, "An animal couldn't do all that, not even a chimpanzee. That escape took skill, it took planning, it took serious smarts. Human-level smarts." He looked into the smuggler's records to get a hint of what the creature was or where it came from. He got nothing. It was as if they got this thing from somewhere and didn't log where it came from or who wanted it. This thing was incredibly strong, incredibly dexterous, and incredibly clever. Who wanted it, and what did they want it for? Part of the reason I'm sharing this is that I'm hoping for some sort of explanation. Some sort of reason why these things happened, and who or what was responsible. Anyone have any theories? Just for a better understanding of my surroundings, I'm from Kentucky. Lots of wooded area, and people love their guns, including me. I used to not believe that there was unknown stuff in the woods. I thought maybe Bigfoot, maybe, could be real, but I seriously doubted it. After this happened though, I know there is something unknown out there. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle, Ruger AR-556 for anyone who cares. and bought a 60-round drum magazine for it at Gander Mountain while they were going out of business, because why the hell not? Reading up on the drum, I read they were amazing and rarely had any issues at all. This will be important later. A few days after I got it, I finally decided to take it out for a test drive and sight in my gun a little better. Here's where everything went to hell. As I said above, Kentucky is super wooded. 3/4 of the land I lived on was just thick woods. There was a main path for driving our gator, and few small paths our cows had made in the woods. I decided to walk along our creek that had a small path half cleared out by our cows. At the end of the path is a big field our cows graze in and where I sight in guns when the cows aren't there. As soon as I crossed the fence to go to the field, I instantly felt like I was being watched, closely. I brushed it off because I've walked back there 1,000 times before and never been bothered by anything. So, I keep walking and ignored the feeling of being watched, but at the same time, I'm aware of the feeling. I know I feel like I'm being watched, but I wasn't giving it any noticeable attention. The walk to the field along the creek is a very short walk, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. The further I walked, the more intense the feeling got, like I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. About halfway there, the feeling got so intense, I couldn't ignore it anymore. The drum magazine I had with me was unloaded, so I stopped and started loading it. I only brought 20 rounds with me because I was just going to sight in my gun, and 20 should have been plenty. So, now I'm stopped, paying extremely close attention to what's going around me and loading my magazine. The exact moment I started putting rounds in the drum, I smelled something dead, like it had been dead for a while and rotting in the sun. I started looking around, and right behind me was what was left of a possum. It was torn to pieces. It was almost like it was placed there for me to find. The only thing was it looked like it had been dead maybe a day at most, and what I was smelling seemed like it was far more decomposed. This obviously didn't sit well with me, so I double-timed it on the magazine loading. I guess I should have taken the dead possum as a last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid. I was almost to the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Just as I was near the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. Me being on edge, I immediately turned toward the noise, gun ready, but no round in the chamber. Walking down the creek away from me was something I will never forget. At least 8 feet tall, probably taller, very skinny. Imagine a grown man that weighs 120 pounds. Now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. It had very long arms, and it walked on 2 legs. Skin stretched tightly across its body. It made no noise, aside from the splash when it stepped in the creek, while it walked. It also had a very weird walk, almost like a waddle, but taking large steps. But that could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost the color of a deer. That's all I can remember about it right now. Now I know why I felt like I was being watched. Magazine loaded, bolt ready to send a round in the chamber. Remember what I said about the magazine being extremely reliable? I pressed the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round just in case this monstrous thing decides to attack. I did not intend on striking first. The round gets stuck somehow and doesn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't fail from heavy use. A bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger, so why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that thing had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again, and I had to return it to Magpul. Needless to say, I didn't tell them this happened. I just told them the magazine failed several times. Anyway, back to the story. The gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The thing books it out of there without running or making a noise. I had just long enough exposure to it to get the details I provided about it. Now, for assumptions. It happened about late May last year. I still have the emails from Magpool regarding the drum, so I'm using those as reference because after this, I needed something reliable. As for what the creature was, me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do have decided it could have been a freaking Wendigo. The reason we think Wendigo is because everything I describe matches them near perfectly. I had read that they are incredibly thin and tall, have a stench of death that follows them everywhere, which explains the smell that I smelled near the possum. Very fast, can be several colors, light brown included, and that they sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans. Again, the possum. The only thing that we couldn't explain was its behavior. Why am I still alive? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it did nothing. It didn't try to attack or confront me. It ran from me like it was scared or trying to draw me where it wanted. All this being said, I have never had another encounter with it. I have gone to the same field, taken the same path expecting to be watched, and have not gotten that feeling of being watched as strongly as that day. Something was out there, and you can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking I'm being watched out there, and it still had no comparison to that day. Hi guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Cryptid sightings seem to be getting more and more common as time goes on. Be sure to subscribe for more scary stories, and if you have any of your own, feel free to send them to the email in the description. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fear Seekers. I'll see you in the next video.